January 17th, 1944. The sun barely peaks over the horizon, casting a pale, cold light on the Pacific waters. Waves lap quietly against the coral shores, masking the tension that churns beneath. From the dense jungle inland, the first Japanese sentries peer through the morning mist, rifles clutched tightly, scanning for any sign of the Allied assault they have long dreaded. Suddenly, the water stirs unnaturally. Shapes emerge from the surf, steel silhouettes, low and menacing, rolling steadily toward the beach. The unmistakable rumble of engines grows louder, drowning out the birdsong. Tanks! Not from land, but from the sea. Japanese troops freeze, eyes wide with disbelief. They had prepared for infantry, artillery, even aircraft. But these iron monsters, defying expectation and imagination, are unlike anything they have faced. Fear spreads like wildfire, hearts racing as the first shells fire. The invasion has begun, and nothing on the island will ever feel safe again. By late 1943, the Pacific theater had reached a critical juncture. Japan, once advancing across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with unstoppable momentum, now faced the relentless push of Allied forces. Islands that had served as staging posts and defensive outposts for the Japanese Empire were falling one by one. Tarawa, Guadalcanal, and Kwajalein had demonstrated the ferocity of amphibious assaults, the vulnerability of even well-fortified positions, and the sheer ingenuity of Allied logistics. Each landing taught both sides a lesson. Terrain mattered, timing mattered, and surprise could turn the tide. The Japanese had fortified their positions on the Pacific Islands meticulously. Coastal defenses were layered with bunkers, pillboxes, and minefields. Snipers lurked in dense jungle foliage. Artillery was positioned to sweep beaches, and machine guns were embedded at every conceivable angle. To the Japanese commanders, the ocean itself seemed a natural barrier, a protective moat against enemy landings. They had not anticipated that steel monsters could traverse the surf. On the Allied side, planning for amphibious operations had become an exercise in precision and innovation. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps had studied every failed and successful landing. Engineers experimented with landing craft, inflatable pontoons, and armored vehicles capable of crossing coral reefs and shallow beaches. Each mission demanded coordination between infantry, artillery, naval bombardments, and air cover, a ballet of destruction designed to overwhelm defenders before they could react. Logistics were the backbone of this strategy. Supplies, tanks, and troops had to arrive in exact sequences, timed to the second. Communication networks were tested under live-fire conditions, and intelligence was gathered from reconnaissance flights, intercepted Japanese communications, and captured documents. Every variable, tide schedules, weather patterns, terrain composition, could determine success or catastrophic failure. Yet, even with careful preparation, the idea of tanks rolling out of the sea remained a bold gamble, an audacious test of amphibious warfare theory. Japanese intelligence had noted Allied movements across the Pacific, but underestimated the scope of engineering advancements. They expected attacks along conventional approaches, infantry and landing craft, supported by artillery barges and fighter cover. The sudden appearance of armored vehicles, adapted for water landings, was outside their frame of reference. Reports from scouting patrols hinted at unusual naval activity, but the combination of deception, radio silence, and tactical feints kept the Japanese commanders uncertain. Fear and disbelief spread among garrison troops. Rumor often filled the gaps where reliable intelligence was absent. The islands themselves presented unique challenges. Coral reefs, shifting tides, and jagged shorelines could easily halt a landing, damaging vessels or stranding troops under fire. Yet the Allies embraced these obstacles, using them to their advantage. Engineers mounted flotation devices to tanks, reinforced tracks for sand and shallow water, and trained crews in synchronized disembarkation. Night exercises, rehearsal landings, and constant drilling honed the coordination required for success. It was a marriage of human determination and mechanical innovation. On the morning of the assault, the Japanese garrison believed themselves ready. Observers scanned the horizon, listening for engines, scanning for troop movements, unaware that the first armored waves were already underway. To the Allied commanders, it was a test of doctrine, courage, and timing. Every calculated risk now depended on the men and machines working in unison to transform theory into reality. In the broader context, the Pacific War had evolved from fast-moving conquest to attritional strategy. The United States, Britain, and their allies sought to push Japan back island by island, gradually tightening the noose around key strategic points. Amphibious operations became the linchpin of this approach. Success relied on surprise, engineering mastery, and overwhelming force. Failure could result in heavy casualties and the loss of momentum, prolonging the war and sacrificing lives. Each landing carried the weight of expectation and consequence. This was the stage on which the tanks would soon make their unexpected entrance. The preparation was complete, the men and machines poised, and the defenders unsuspecting. What followed would redefine both fear and battlefield reality for the Japanese troops who faced the surf, the sand, and the steel rolling toward them. The question now shifted from could this landing succeed to how would the defenders react when tanks appeared from the sea? Landing tanks on hostile shores was not a simple matter of driving them off a boat. The Pacific Islands, with their jagged coral reefs, shifting tides, and unpredictable surf, presented challenges that demanded ingenuity, discipline, and engineering skill. Standard tanks could not float, and heavy armor risked sinking or being stranded before reaching the beach. Allied planners knew that for an amphibious assault to succeed, every detail, from tide charts to tank flotation devices, had to be perfect. Engineers devised specialized landing craft capable of carrying armor directly to the water's edge. Lighter vehicles were loaded onto Higgins boats, while larger tanks, like the M4 Sherman, were mounted on LVTs, amphibious tracked vehicles designed to traverse reefs and shallow surf. These landing vehicles were reinforced to prevent corrosion, fitted with extra buoyancy pontoons, and tested relentlessly in simulated beach conditions. Crews practiced disembarkation under fire, learning how to release tanks into the surf without tipping or stalling. Every movement was choreographed to the second, as miscalculations could strand vehicles and turn them into immobile targets. Training for the assault extended far beyond mechanical preparation. Troops conducted night maneuvers to simulate limited visibility, coordinated artillery barges to suppress enemy positions, and synchronized air cover to neutralize Japanese defenses. Communication between naval vessels, landing craft, and tank crews was painstakingly rehearsed, often with signal flags and radios operating simultaneously. Even the weather became a variable to master. Tide tables were cross-referenced with moon phases, and reconnaissance flights charted wave patterns and beach gradients. The planning was meticulous, the stakes absolute. The psychological component of the operation was equally significant. Troops were briefed that the tanks would strike fear into the enemy and pave the way for infantry to secure the beachhead. This required confidence and precision. Any hesitation could compromise the assault. Soldiers drilled repeatedly, enduring grueling exercises in tropical heat and rough waters, building muscle memory for the exact timing and placement of each tank. Even minor errors, a delayed disembarkation or a misaligned ramp, could imperil lives and the entire mission. On the Japanese side, coastal fortifications were formidable, but not invulnerable. Bunkers lined the beaches, and machine guns swept the sand with deadly efficiency. Mines and barbed wire obstructed conventional landings. Artillery, strategically placed, could target approaching vessels before they reached shore. Yet, despite these defenses, the Japanese had no precedent for an armored assault from the sea. They assumed tanks were restricted to land-based operations, underestimating the Allies' technical ingenuity and adaptability. This underestimation would soon prove decisive. Intelligence played a key role in the planning. Reconnaissance teams observed Japanese positions, noting gun emplacements, troop concentrations, and natural obstacles. Photographs and captured maps informed the engineers' designs, while intercepted communications provided insights into enemy expectations. The combination of raw data and inventive engineering allowed the Allies to turn the impossible into a tangible plan. Armored vehicles could arrive from the sea, breach the defenses, and create chaos before Japanese troops could respond effectively. The landing itself demanded flawless execution. Tanks had to exit landing craft at precisely the right moment, maintaining formation under heavy fire. Crews navigated obstacles in the surf, timing movements with artillery support that suppressed enemy positions. Infantry followed closely, using the protection of armored steel to push inland. This integration of men, machines, and firepower was unprecedented in scale and complexity, requiring absolute trust in training and equipment. By the dawn of the assault, the operation had been rehearsed countless times. Engineers, tank crews, and infantrymen understood the stakes. Failure meant disaster. Success meant opening a new chapter in amphibious warfare. The Japanese defenders, unaware of the armored surprise awaiting them, believed they had prepared for every conceivable scenario. They were wrong. The beach, the surf, and the jungle beyond would soon be a theater of confusion, terror, and unmatched firepower. The stage was set. The tanks were ready. The sea would deliver them to the enemy's doorstep, and in the process, transform the battlefield in ways Japanese troops had never imagined. For the Japanese troops stationed on the Pacific Islands, the morning the tanks appeared from the sea was a moment of pure disbelief. Months of preparation, months of drilling defensive tactics, had not prepared them for armored machines advancing across the surf. From the dense jungle to the sand-strewn beaches, fear spread almost instantaneously. Officers barked orders, but many soldiers were paralyzed by the sight of steel hulls rolling through the waves, their guns spitting fire before any return could be organized. The human response was immediate and visceral. Men crouched behind bunkers, swapping bewildered glances. Some fired blindly, hoping to halt the machines. Others froze, unsure whether to retreat or engage. The psychological shock of seeing tanks disembark directly from landing craft undermined Japanese training and morale. What had once seemed a predictable battlefield now became chaotic and unpredictable. Reports from survivors describe the deafening roar of engines, the pounding of treads on sand, and the eerie sight of armored silhouettes emerging from the morning mist. Fear, more than firepower, became the first casualty of this assault. For the Allied soldiers and tank crews, the operation demanded nerves of steel. Amphibious landings were inherently perilous. The surf threatened to capsize landing craft. Reefs could immobilize tanks, and Japanese artillery lined the beaches with lethal precision. Crews had to navigate not only physical obstacles, but also the mental weight of knowing that any hesitation could cost lives. The rhythm of the landing was calculated. Tanks disembark in precise sequences, infantry follows in tight formation, and supporting artillery suppresses enemy positions. Each movement was rehearsed countless times, yet executing it under live fire elevated tension to a near unbearable level. Tactically, the arrival of tanks from the sea redefined the battlefield almost instantly. Bunkers and machine gun nests designed to halt infantry now faced mobile, heavily armored threats that could crush obstacles in their path. The combination of armored protection and coordinated firepower allowed Allied troops to breach defensive lines that would have otherwise held firm. Engineers had anticipated obstacles like barbed wire and mines, and the tanks, reinforced and buoyant, could neutralize these barriers with calculated precision. The Japanese had prepared for infantry assaults, but had no means to counter the armored advance in the surf. The interplay between fear and tactic became evident in real time. Japanese troops attempted counterattacks, firing at the advancing tanks, but their ammunition was largely ineffective against armor. Officers attempted to rally men, shouting commands over the roar of engines, but communication broke down as panic set in. Soldiers who had trained for months to hold the beach now scrambled to find cover or retreat inland. The human element, courage, hesitation, confusion, collided with the mechanical inevitability of the tanks, amplifying the assault's effectiveness. From the Allied perspective, every successful tank landing reinforced confidence and momentum. Infantry units followed the armored advance, using the protection of steel to move into enemy lines. Observers noted the psychological impact. Japanese defenders were slower to reload, slower to aim, and increasingly erratic in their movements. Tactical principles, suppress, flank, advance, were executed with lethal efficiency. Even minor missteps by the defenders were exploited immediately, turning individual hesitations into cascading failures across defensive positions. The terrain itself played a decisive role. Coral reefs, previously thought to be defensive advantages, became channels for tanks equipped with reinforced tracks and amphibious mechanisms. High tide allowed landing craft to approach closer than anticipated, while the shallow surf enabled tanks to disembark directly onto the beach. The coordination between men, machines, and environment was seamless, illustrating the meticulous planning that underpinned the assault. Every wave and every grain of sand had been considered in training exercises, yet the real test lay in human execution under the terror of battle. By the time Japanese officers recognized the true nature of the threat, the tactical advantage had shifted irrevocably. Tanks had broken through defensive lines, infantry had landed with support, and the initial shock had morphed into confusion and retreat. The human and tactical dimensions were intertwined. Fear dictated movement, mistakes created openings, and the mechanical precision of armored vehicles exploited both. This perspective highlights not just the physical presence of the tanks, but their impact on the minds and actions of the soldiers facing them. On one side, human courage battled against overwhelming odds. On the other, meticulous planning and mechanical power dictated the flow of events. The clash of these elements would set the stage for the next layer of analysis: technological, leadership, and enemy perspectives, revealing how engineering and command decisions shaped the battle's outcome. The tanks themselves were marvels of wartime engineering. The M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the Allied forces, had been adapted for amphibious operations. Engineers added flotation devices and reinforced tracks to navigate shallow reefs and sandy beaches. Engines were tuned for maximum reliability under the stress of saltwater exposure, and weapon systems were calibrated to function even when waves crashed against the hull. Each vehicle represented not only firepower, but also innovation, a physical embodiment of Allied ingenuity aimed directly at breaking the Japanese defensive mindset. On board, crews had to master both machine and environment. Every lever, hatch, and cannon required precise operation under the most chaotic conditions. Tanks moved in coordinated formations, protecting infantry and maintaining momentum across the beach. The technology was only as effective as the crew operating it, yet rigorous training had instilled muscle memory and confidence. The mechanical presence of the tanks, paired with disciplined human control, transformed the battlefield into a system of calculated destruction. Leadership on both sides played a decisive role. Allied commanders orchestrated the amphibious assault with meticulous timing. Naval bombardments were synchronized with tank disembarkation. Infantry movements were planned to exploit the armored advance. Commanders monitored the landing from offshore ships and forward observation posts, adjusting orders based on real-time observations of enemy behavior. This level of coordination required clarity, decisiveness, and trust in subordinate units, a complex dance in which every misstep could cost lives. For Japanese officers, the emergence of tanks from the sea created immediate tactical confusion. Their defensive plans had anticipated infantry attacks, supported by artillery, not mobile armored vehicles arriving in unexpected locations. Attempts to mount counterattacks were hampered by both terrain and fear. Officers shouted commands over the cacophony of engines and gunfire, but communication was inconsistent and coordination broke down under pressure. Individual bravery often clashed with systemic disorganization. Even well-trained soldiers could not compensate for the shock of a threat they had no precedent for facing. Enemy intelligence failures compounded the problem. Reconnaissance had noted unusual Allied activity, but the Japanese misjudged the scale and nature of the amphibious operation. They underestimated both the engineering solutions that allowed tanks to cross the surf and the speed at which Allied forces could exploit openings. In essence, they were fighting yesterday's war with today's weapons, prepared for infantry and artillery, but blind to the armored innovation coming directly at them. Technology and leadership intertwined to produce psychological as well as physical effects. The sight of tanks advancing across the surf shattered Japanese morale before much actual engagement had occurred. Soldiers retreated, bunkers were abandoned, and firing accuracy declined under the stress of surprise and fear. The tanks were not just weapons. They were symbols of inevitability, a moving testament to the Allies' ability to overcome natural and man-made obstacles alike. On the Allied side, leadership emphasized flexibility. Officers empowered junior commanders and tank crews to make real-time decisions in response to unexpected resistance. This decentralized approach ensured that progress continued even when individual units encountered obstacles. Tanks and infantry acted as extensions of command intent, moving according to both pre-planned strategy and battlefield conditions. The result was an adaptive, resilient force capable of sustaining momentum despite unpredictability. The technological edge extended beyond the tanks themselves. Landing craft, communications equipment, and artillery were all integrated into a system designed to maximize the surprise and lethality of the assault. Each innovation, whether a reinforced hull, a tracked vehicle designed for coral reefs, or a timed barrage, contributed to an overwhelming combined arms effect. By contrast, Japanese defenders were constrained by static fortifications, outdated intelligence, and rigid command hierarchies that could not adapt quickly to the unfolding reality. In combination, these factors created a decisive imbalance. The Japanese forces faced a dual challenge, coping with the tangible threat of armored vehicles and the intangible weight of psychological shock. Leadership, technology, and ingenuity converged to redefine the battlefield. The human response, no matter how courageous, struggled against an enemy that had effectively weaponized both steel and planning. The convergence of technological innovation, inspired leadership, and enemy unpreparedness set the stage for the climactic moment. The tanks had broken through initial defenses, but the ultimate turning point, where the battle's outcome would be decided, was still to come. The next phase would reveal how these factors collided in the heat of combat, reshaping the fight for the island entirely. Dawn had barely begun to stain the horizon when the first landing craft approached the beach. The surf slapped against the hulls of the Higgins boats, rocking the crews as they braced for the inevitable chaos. Inside, the tanks rumbled, engines growling, as armored silhouettes shifted against the pale morning light. The soldiers inside knew the stakes. Each second counted, and any misstep could strand them in the water under Japanese fire. As the landing craft reached the surf, Japanese defenders finally realized the enormity of what confronted them. From their bunkers, machine guns opened fire, bullets tearing through sand and water. Mortar rounds exploded nearby, sending geysers of debris into the air. Yet the tanks pressed forward, their reinforced hulls shrugging off minor damage. Tracks ground against coral and sand, and with a calculated lurch, the first vehicles emerged onto the beach, rolling steadily past mines and barbed wire that would have halted infantry. The effect on Japanese troops was immediate. Confusion rippled through the defenders like a shockwave. Men froze, unsure whether to advance, retreat, or fire. Some attempted to man machine guns, but the roar of engines and the steady advance of armored steel was disorienting. Officers shouted commands, but panic often overpowered training. The psychological shock of seeing armored vehicles emerging directly from the sea had destabilized even veteran soldiers. Tactically, the tanks created a breach that infantry units exploited instantly. Behind the armored advance, Marines and Army infantry disembarked from the landing craft, using the tanks as cover. Machine gun nests were suppressed, pillboxes bypassed, and trenches rendered ineffective. Every movement was synchronized, a deadly choreography learned in countless rehearsals but executed under real fire for the first time. The surf, the sand, and the smoke from naval bombardments created a haze that concealed advancing troops, amplifying the surprise and terror experienced by the defenders. Individual moments illustrate the human cost and intensity of the breakthrough. A Japanese machine gun crew, caught off guard, abandoned their post as a tank rolled past, crushing obstacles in its path. Nearby, infantrymen scrambled to reposition, only to encounter a second wave of armor. The cumulative effect of tanks and supporting infantry disrupted defensive cohesion, breaking lines that had seemed impenetrable in theory. Reports from survivors later described this period as a blur of noise, movement, and fear, with men unsure where safety could be found. Naval artillery added another layer of pressure. Short batteries had been partially neutralized by pre-landing bombardments, but remaining guns fired sporadically at advancing waves. Tanks, however, continued to move through these zones with remarkable resilience. Engineers had calculated armor thickness and spacing to maximize survival against small-caliber artillery, and crews applied tactical maneuvers learned in practice to avoid predictable paths of fire. The combination of design, training, and audacity ensured that the initial assault would succeed where less prepared forces had failed. By mid-morning, the breach was fully established. The first line of Japanese defense was shattered, creating corridors for additional troops and vehicles to land. The coordinated application of armor, infantry, and supporting fire created a cascading effect. Once the initial panic took hold, command and control on the Japanese side became nearly impossible. Units retreated inland, bunkers were abandoned, and isolated pockets of resistance could not consolidate. The psychological dominance of the tanks had translated directly into tactical success. Throughout the breakthrough, leadership decisions on both sides were magnified in their consequences. Allied officers observed the progress, redirecting tanks to weak points, ordering infantry to exploit gaps, and coordinating artillery to neutralize counterattacks. Japanese commanders, meanwhile, struggled to organize responses under duress. Attempts to regroup were stymied by the speed and coordination of the assault, leaving soldiers without clear guidance in the midst of a rapidly shifting battlefield. By late morning, the beachhead was secure. The initial wave of tanks and infantry had achieved what had seemed impossible: a coordinated landing under fire that neutralized entrenched defenders and created momentum for further advances. The breakthrough was not just a tactical success. It was a demonstration of the power of preparation, innovation, and audacity combined. The first phase of the assault had ended, but the battle was far from over. The Japanese, though disoriented, were regrouping. Counterattacks, reinforcements, and desperate maneuvers loomed ahead. The full impact of armored warfare in this amphibious context would only be realized as the battle escalated into its decisive moments. As the morning wore on, the tide of battle shifted irreversibly. Japanese units, initially caught in panic, attempted to regroup behind secondary defensive positions inland. Bunkers and trenches that had seemed secure were now exposed, their effectiveness diminished by the relentless advance of tanks and infantry. The armored vehicles, moving with calculated precision, exploited every gap, flanking positions, and neutralizing resistance with suppressive fire. What had begun as confusion on the beaches transformed into a systematic dismantling of the enemy's defensive network. At 9:45, the first major counterattack occurred. Japanese troops, rallying behind field artillery and small arms fire, sought to stem the armored advance. Tanks responded immediately, adjusting formations to absorb incoming fire and using their weight to crush obstacles. Infantry coordinated closely, engaging defenders disoriented by the steel advance. Within minutes, the counterattack was broken. Japanese soldiers retreated, leaving key positions undefended, their morale shattered by the mechanical inevitability of the tanks. One decisive factor was the integration of firepower. Naval guns offshore continued bombardments while artillery inland targeted isolated strongpoints. Tanks provided mobile cover, enabling infantry to advance without exposing themselves to machine gun fire. The combination of suppressive fire, armored mobility, and human coordination created a synergy the defenders could not counter. Japanese attempts at ambush were neutralized before they could materialize, turning planned resistance into a series of isolated, futile skirmishes. By late morning, the momentum was entirely in Allied hands. Tanks had penetrated deep inland, linking up with infantry units, securing key crossroads and communication points. The Japanese defensive network was fragmented. Isolated pockets of resistance were overwhelmed one by one. Observers later noted that the psychological impact of armored vehicles, relentless, unstoppable, and emerging from a previously secure front, had accelerated the collapse of command and cohesion among defenders. Fear had become as effective a weapon as steel or artillery. Leadership decisions during this phase were critical. Allied commanders maintained flexibility, allowing tank crews to exploit weak points and infantry units to seize ground without waiting for rigid orders. Japanese leaders, however, struggled to coordinate under extreme pressure. Attempts to reinforce faltering lines were delayed or misdirected, leaving soldiers to face tanks and advancing infantry without support. Communication failures compounded the impact of tactical setbacks, illustrating the interplay between leadership, morale, and battlefield outcomes. By early afternoon, the Japanese defensive strategy had effectively collapsed. Tanks had neutralized key fortifications, infantry had secured high ground, and artillery positions were either captured or silenced. The beachhead was no longer contested. It had become a staging point for further advances into the island's interior. The decisive moments of the assault demonstrated the transformative effect of armored warfare when combined with careful planning, engineering innovation, and coordinated human execution. The human element remained evident even in victory. Allied troops were exhausted, moving through sand and smoke, yet morale surged with every objective secured. Japanese soldiers, meanwhile, faced the grim reality of defeat. Some attempted guerrilla-style resistance deeper in the jungle, but the initial shock, compounded by losses and disrupted command structures, had irreversibly shifted the balance of power. The combination of steel, firepower, and disciplined execution ensured that the victory was both swift and complete. By late afternoon, the full significance of the assault was clear. The tanks had not merely breached defenses, They had redefined the battlefield. Japanese troops had been overwhelmed not only by technology, but by the integration of planning, human courage, and mechanical precision. The turning point had been reached, the momentum secured, and the island's future now firmly in Allied hands. By evening, the beachhead was firmly in Allied hands. The morning's chaos had transformed into a controlled consolidation of territory. Tanks, having breached the initial defensive lines, now secured supply routes and key positions along the beach. Infantry units moved inland under the protection of armored support, clearing pockets of resistance and establishing defensive perimeters for follow-up forces. What had begun as a daring assault had evolved into a tangible, strategic foothold. The human cost was immediate and stark. Japanese casualties were severe. Estimates suggest that hundreds of soldiers were killed or wounded during the initial landing and the subsequent inland push. Entire machine gun nests and bunkers had been overrun, their defenders either eliminated or scattered. Survivors described a battlefield transformed into a tableau of fear, smoke, and devastation, where familiar defensive structures no longer offered protection. Allied forces, while better prepared and supported, also suffered losses. Tanks bogged down in surf or struck mines. Infantrymen were wounded by artillery or sniper fire, and confusion in the early moments led to localized casualties. Yet, the meticulous planning and integration of armor, infantry, and artillery minimized losses compared to previous amphibious operations. Tactically, the operation had succeeded beyond expectations. The armored assault had not only secured the beach, but disrupted Japanese defensive cohesion. Strategic positions that were considered strong points, such as high ground overlooking the shore, had fallen or were abandoned. The psychological impact on Japanese troops was profound. Fear and disbelief had replaced morale and confidence. In many cases, soldiers retreated before the full force of the assault reached them, creating openings for Allied forces to exploit. Supply lines were established almost immediately. Engineers and logistics teams moved quickly to offload ammunition, rations, and reinforcements, ensuring that the beachhead could support sustained operations inland. Tanks were refueled, repaired, and redeployed, maintaining the momentum of the advance. The speed of this logistical response highlighted the meticulous preparation behind the assault, turning a tactical success into a sustainable operational advantage. Communication across units proved critical. Allied commanders monitored progress from both offshore vessels and forward observation points. Real-time adjustments were made to redirect armored units to weak points, coordinate artillery fire, and support infantry movements. Japanese forces, by contrast, struggled with disjointed communication. Orders were often delayed, misinterpreted, or ignored, further amplifying the effectiveness of the Allied assault. The breakdown of Japanese command structures contributed significantly to the rapid establishment of the beachhead. The immediate consequences extended beyond the battlefield itself. Reports from surviving Japanese soldiers and intercepted communications indicated widespread shock and demoralization. Commanders noted that the appearance of tanks from the sea was entirely unexpected, and their ability to neutralize bunkers and machine gun nests created panic that disrupted defensive plans. Even those troops who survived the landing were left shaken, their confidence in the island's fortifications irrevocably shaken. For the Allies, the victory had tangible and symbolic significance. It validated the concept of armored amphibious warfare and demonstrated the effectiveness of combining engineering ingenuity with disciplined execution. Lessons learned from the landing: the coordination of tanks, infantry, artillery, and naval support would inform subsequent operations across the Pacific, shaping strategies for future assaults on fortified islands. As night fell, the beachhead was secured, but the implications of the assault extended far beyond the immediate shoreline. The operation had inflicted casualties shattered morale, and established a strategic advantage. The success of the landing set the stage for deeper advances into enemy-held territory, while the Japanese forces faced the daunting task of regrouping under the shadow of armored dominance. The immediate aftermath highlighted not only the physical outcomes of the assault, but also its psychological and operational effects. Soldiers on both sides were forever changed by the confrontation, while commanders recognized the transformative potential of amphibious armored warfare. The implications of the tanks emerging from the sea extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The successful amphibious assault demonstrated the transformative potential of combining armored vehicles with careful planning, engineering innovation, and disciplined execution. Military observers from both sides took note. For the Allies, it validated years of experimentation with amphibious doctrine and reinforced the value of integrating armor into beach landings. Future operations, including assaults on more heavily fortified islands, would rely heavily on lessons learned here. The timing of tank disembarkation, coordination with infantry, and suppression of defensive positions through firepower and maneuver. Japanese military planners, by contrast, faced a sobering reckoning. The traditional reliance on static defenses, entrenched bunkers, and predictable approaches had been thoroughly exposed. The psychological impact of armored vehicles arriving directly from the surf became a cautionary tale, underscoring the need for flexible tactics and adaptive responses to technological innovations. Subsequent defensive planning incorporated these lessons, but the speed and effectiveness of the Allied amphibious assault had already set a precedent that could not easily be countered. The success of this operation influenced broader strategic planning in the Pacific theater. Islands that had previously been considered secure became vulnerable once amphibious armor was integrated into landing strategies. Naval commanders and amphibious engineers refined landing craft, flotation devices, and vehicle deployment techniques, creating a system capable of projecting armored power across wide expanses of water. This evolution shifted the balance of power in island campaigns, allowing Allied forces to seize critical objectives with greater speed and efficiency than conventional infantry landings alone could achieve. Beyond immediate tactical and operational consequences, the psychological impact endured. Japanese troops faced the persistent awareness that armored assaults could emerge anywhere along the coast, creating constant pressure on defensive planning and troop morale. Even after retreating from the beachhead, soldiers reported lingering fear and uncertainty, a recognition that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. For Allied soldiers, the operation instilled confidence in their training, their technology, and their ability to execute complex, high-stakes missions under fire. Historical records and survivor accounts confirm the significance of the operation. After-action reports praised the precision of tank landings, the seamless coordination with infantry, and the suppression of enemy positions. Japanese officers acknowledged the disruptive effect of armored landings, noting that defensive strategies had been outmatched by innovation and execution. The engagement became a reference point in military studies, illustrating the impact of technological adaptation and the integration of multiple combat arms in amphibious operations. The operation also shaped future amphibious doctrines. Military academies studied the assault as a case study in planning, logistics, and psychological warfare. Engineers refined landing vehicles and flotation systems, while commanders emphasized the importance of adaptability and rapid decision-making under unpredictable conditions. The lessons were applied in subsequent campaigns across the Pacific, influencing assaults on fortified islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each subsequent landing carried the imprint of this early demonstration of armored amphibious power. Ultimately, the long-term effects extended beyond the tactical and operational. The battle highlighted the interplay between technology, human psychology, and leadership. It demonstrated that battlefield outcomes could be decisively influenced not only by firepower, but also by the innovative application of engineering solutions and coordinated strategy. Both sides, in their own ways, were forced to adapt, learn, and reconsider the principles that had governed warfare in the Pacific up to that point. The immediate victory at the beachhead was only the beginning. Its significance rippled through the remainder of the Pacific campaign, shaping both strategy and mindset. The emergence of tanks from the sea had redefined the rules of engagement, creating a legacy of innovation, audacity, and tactical evolution that would echo across the islands and throughout the war. This naturally leads into the reflection/closure, where we consider the broader philosophical, historical, and human meaning of the assault and its legacy in warfare. The image of tanks emerging from the sea remains one of the most striking symbols of ingenuity and audacity in World War II. On a single morning, steel and human courage converged to redefine the rules of warfare in the Pacific. The assault was more than a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of how innovation, preparation, and discipline could overcome even the most formidable defenses. For the Japanese soldiers on the beach, it was a moment of disorientation and fear, a reminder that the battlefield is often governed as much by surprise and perception as by numbers and firepower. For the Allies, the operation validated years of experimentation and relentless rehearsal. Engineers, planners, and soldiers had transformed theory into reality, turning logistical and technological challenges into decisive advantages. The successful integration of tanks into an amphibious landing illustrated the evolving nature of war, where adaptability, creativity, and coordination could shape outcomes as dramatically as bullets and shells. Beyond tactics, the battle highlighted the human dimension of warfare. Fear, confusion, courage, and leadership played roles as critical as machinery. Soldiers faced choices under pressure that tested training, instinct, and resilience. Commanders made decisions that rippled across the battlefield, proving that foresight and adaptability could magnify the power of even the most advanced equipment. Strategically, the assault signaled a turning point in amphibious operations. Future landings across the Pacific would adopt lessons learned here, refining the integration of armored vehicles, infantry, and supporting firepower. The psychological impact on defenders, combined with the operational success, made clear that innovation could break stalemates and shape the course of campaigns. Ultimately, the tanks on the shore were more than weapons. They were agents of change, reshaping the landscape of war and human perception alike. The morning that steel rolled from the sea reminds us that conflict is never static, that courage and ingenuity can redefine the possible, and that the human and technological elements of warfare are inseparable. In the annals of history, the moment endures, a testament to the audacity of planning, the resilience of soldiers, and the profound transformations that arise when innovation meets opportunity.